Hi guys, first of all, hope you all had a really good Christmas and a happy new year. This video tutorial is going to look over a improved contact form using PHP and HTML along with some jQuery validation. This tutorial will effectively replace the original contact form tutorial I did quite a while ago now. The tutorial features some security measures and validation techniques that we didn't cover on that first video tutorial. So hopefully this should show a slightly more well-rounded contact form that you can use on your website. So this is the form that I've created. Very simple styling and a simple transition effect on the send button. And we've got our jQuery validation working when we hit the send button. We're using the jQuery validate plugin. Have a Google online and you'll see it available in the top search result. The documentation there is definitely worth having a look at, as what I'm going to show you is just what I need or what I've used for this tutorial example, and it's by no means the limit of what the plugin can do. In fact, it's very flexible and can allow you to do lots of really clever things, from the different types of error messages you can output to actually how you can place or where you place and transition in the error messages themselves. As you can see, we've got 3 different error messages appearing here for each of the fields. We've got our empty state for our name field, currently our empty state for our email field, and again the empty state for your message. So when I start typing in a character on the name field, we'll see that it actually changes. This is because I've put a minimum character limit on this field, just to prevent single character names being submitted. And obviously you can play around with this to best suit your needs, or you might not want it at all. On the email address field, when we start typing, you'll note that it changes to asking to enter a valid email address. And again, if we remove it, it comes back to the empty error message. Having entered a valid email, we can see the message is gone, and we can now go on to the next field. jQuery Validate uses a system of pattern matches through regex and other features to check its email addresses. Again, what it's actually doing is checking to see whether the data typed in matches a certain pattern or allowed characters within a certain length of the string or area of the string. So it's by no means foolproof, and there are other other plugins that you can use to do things like email address lookups, where they'll check popular email services like Hotmail or Yahoo to see if that's valid, or even have a long list of possible email vendors. So when you start typing HOT, it comes up with Hotmail as the potential provider of the email service. It depends how far you want to go with email lookup, and there's always going to be some area of certainty with somebody's email address potentially not quite meeting the pattern that's been entered. But jQuery Validate does a fairly good job of validating most email addresses. Finally, the message field, I've again added a character limit, this time of 50 characters. As you can see, when the message is less than 50 characters, we have the following message appear. And then disappears once the value becomes valid. Clicking on the send button now allows us to send the message through, as all of the criteria within the jQuery Validate plugin have been met, and we can send the form out. I've also factored in the potential for jQuery being unavailable, or not working, or being an error with the jQuery Validate plugin. Some people won't necessarily consider this to be necessary. One, because it adds additional code that you have to write, and 2, there's the provision that if a user has willingly turned off their JavaScript in their browser, they're probably not the right kind of user you want visiting your site anyway, especially if your site has lots of other jQuery on it. And I can understand that, especially in today's age with web technologies being as far along as they are, and being an integral part of both user interaction and animation on a website. However, especially on contact forms, I think it's crucial that you do have a fallback in place should something occur and prevent the jQuery validation from working. So we've got that code in place as well, and I'll show you an example of that towards the end of this tutorial. Now we'll have a look at the actual code itself. Firstly, we'll have a look at the HTML. At this point, and at several points throughout the video, I'll mention you might want to stop the video to write down the code. I may make some of the code available later on. However, I'm trying not to do this, as the aim of my tutorials are to help you understand, not simply provide you with scripts that you can download and use. I'd much prefer, or I'm hoping that I'm being able to teach people some useful techniques to use on their sites. However, if you do have any problem with the code that you've used or that you've pulled off of the site, you can always email me examples of the code, and I'll provide an email for that later on. So, if you want to stop the video now and copy this first section of code down, then do so now. Okay, so this is a fairly standard template for an HTML5 document. We have our doc type at the top, and we've specified our link to our CSS file, along with the JavaScript includes for both the jQuery codebase and for the jQuery validate plugin. Below we have our jQuery validate plugin options, and these are all driven off of the input name attribute field. So where I've named name, email and message, that corresponds to the name attribute field on my input fields further down in my HTML form. And obviously it's important that you get these right in order for them to operate correctly. We have two sections here, our rules and our messages. Our rules dictate what each field should be validated against or for. So the required field states that the field in question, i.e. name, email and message, cannot be empty and therefore are required an entry. We also have our minimum length, so for our name they must enter at least 2 characters, whereas for our message they must enter at least 50 characters. On our email field we have this email value set to true, which simply states that this field needs to be validated with an email against an email verification method. Our messages section below again do a fairly similar process. We go through the different validation rules that we've set above and enter the error messages that we'd want to appear should one of these not be met. You can see it's fairly straightforward to configure, and again it's worth checking out the documentation on the jQuery Validate site for more information on how to get the most out of the plugin. Again, you may want to pause the video here just to copy down this bottom section of code. If you paused the video earlier, you'd have seen from the top of the doc type to the closing head tag, line 99. So if you want to copy the code from line 100 to line 122, now's a good time to do that. As you can see, there's not a lot to our form. We're using the post method to send the form to our PHP page within itself, which is what we've got with our action, the server PHP self function. We're simply doing this to validate the form completely against HTML5, and there's no harm in simply removing it and leaving it blank. And again, there's no harm in having your site invalid either, as especially with HTML5, a lot of the features and functionality are still in draft or a test phase, and therefore still may change, and therefore the validation has to take that into account and actually mentions that in the W3C validator if you're using that tool. You might notice this no validate entry at the end. This simply allows us to tell browsers to prevent or turn off their existing form validation techniques. What I mean by this is that if you've gone to a website with a form using an up-to-date browser, Internet Explorer 10 or 11, Chrome, Firefox's latest versions for example, you might see when you click onto a form that a little tooltip appears and asks you to enter a valid email address. And typically this isn't actually the website, this is actually the browser doing it for you. Now you can't really style these to much extent because of how the browsers operate. But what you can do is tell them not to validate the form. And that's what we've done here, because again we've got our own validation in place and we don't want to alarm the browser doing it for us. Below we have a section of PHP code which looks at our two message states effectively, sent or has error. If if sent is true, and you'll notice that we have our 3 equal signs next to each other, which means it has to exactly match this value here, true. You'll see that we've got our success message underneath. However, if it hasn't been sent and the hasError value is stored as true, we're going to echo out an error list, and we're going to loop through an error array which we build in the PHP section above, which I'll show you in a moment. And we list out the error messages. This does a fairly similar thing to the jQuery validate plugin, but this runs on the server side, and this is what we'll use should jQuery or the validate plugin be unavailable and the form be submitted with an invalid field. So let's scroll up to the code, to the PHP code now. At the top, we set our 2 message success values, hasError and sent, and we set them to false just to prevent the form being manipulated in any way or being held over and information being sent through time and time again. We then have our isSet function for our form. This checks to see whether or not the form has actually been submitted, and therefore only runs the following code if that's happened. We then store name, email and message that we get with our post variable here from the form that's been submitted, and we apply trim and HTML special characters to the name and message field just to help remove any HTML character, or sorry, to escape any HTML characters and convert them if necessary. This helps obviously prevent malicious code being entered and used, especially as we're sending this to an email client as well. We don't do anything to the email field at the moment, and we look at that slightly further down. Effectively, once we've collected our email values, our field values that we've sent from our form, we enter them into this array, fields array, and this is simply for us to then loop through further on and apply any error messages to, or further validation if required. And again, this is the validation that would be used by PHP on the server should the jQuery and validate plugin not be working for any reason. We also set up our error array just outside the for each so that we can enter the errors into them. So for each of our field arrays, so for name, email and message, we go through the following. Inside, we go through a switch case function, which looks at the key, which is name, email or message. And if the case, so name and message here run the same function, or email below, matches the key in the fields array, it runs the following code. And for name and message, it's simply checking to make sure that the value is not empty, because we've already done our trim and special characters above. And you could build on that as well, adding additional functions to escape characters, especially if you're going to enter the values into a database to record them for later. This effectively sets the error to true, which will then halt the mail process further on, and it also stores the key and message for the field in the error array by using the key here, which is uppercase, which is capitalized even, and a simple message, just to indicate to the user which field was at fault. Further on, we have the email validation using the PHP filter variable. First of all, we check to see if the email is actually valid, and this the filter validate email goes through several validation methods, including a regex pattern match, similar to the jQuery one. It simply states that if the email doesn't validate, there's an error, and the email address is invalid, and again we store it in the error array. However, if it is valid, what we then do is sanitize the email address, so we encode any HTML characters or remove them where necessary. Again, done by the PHP filter var function. Once this is done, our final check is whether or not an error has been detected, and therefore has error been set. If it hasn't, we then generate the following areas of code, which is what we need for our mail function down here. The code that I've used here will create a basic email which will support HTML characters and should work on most mail clients. However, it's definitely worth having a look online and on the PHP website for the headers and optional headers setting for the mail function, as there are lots of different ways in which you can utilize this to send messages across the internet and to mail clients. Finally, we check if the mail has been sent, set sent to true, and then we unset name, email and message. This is so that when the success message is displayed on the site, the form fields name, email and message don't retain the previously stored values that were submitted on success. However, if jQuery validate isn't working and the PHP function validation function has to come into effect, it means that these values are kept in the form so that you don't have to retype things. So if you've typed a long message and you hit submit and the PHP validates it, it's not going to lose that message information and you're not going to have to retype everything, which I often find on many web forms and find particularly annoying. So what I'm going to do is scroll up to the top and again give you a chance to pause the video here to have a look through this code, and I'll scroll down slightly in a moment for you to see the rest of the PHP code. Okay, so now we'll have a quick look at the CSS I've applied to this tutorial. At the top you'll see that I've done a quick reset on some of the standard elements on all and on the HTML element of the margin padding and no outline. And you'll notice this section at the top as well, which is something I tend to do now on almost every web project. It's the box sizing CSS attribute, and we set it to border box. This is particularly useful when working with widths and padding of elements and borders, so that the width, especially if you're using percentages, isn't affected by a 1 pixel border, which is obviously going to impact the percentage value differently. I tend to add this to almost all of my projects now, especially responsive projects, which will be using columns and percentage layouts. If you're interested in responsive layouts, there'll be I'm going to look at doing another tutorial on that, so we should have some more information on that for you to look at later on. But do go and have a Google of it and see what box sizing could potentially do for you and your web development. These items here help to remove the small cross that will appear at the end of input fields on Internet Explorer and WebKit-based browsers, Chrome and Safari. Again, this is because we want to have full control over the appearance of our forms. However, you may want to add some in, and it's definitely worth, again, going away and having a Google of these functions and features to see if you would like to use them on your form. The rest of the CSS is fairly straightforward. Our main elements here is that we've styled it with some with rounded corners and with a box shadow around the contact form to give it that subtle effect. Again, the form itself will work entirely without any of the CSS. However, I'll pause the video. If you want to pause the video now, I'll scroll back up to the top so you can take down some of these styles. And there you are. So, going back to our form. It's a fairly basic layout, and we've got our jQuery working as fine, as described in the code. What we'll do now is go back into our code and quickly disable the jQuery validate. And we'll simply do this by just removing the script link for the moment. So, now that we've disabled the jQuery validate plugin, let's see how our PHP code works when we actually submit the form. So as you can see, the form definitely submits now. There's no jQuery preventing it from being submitted. And what happens is that rather than having an email sent off correctly, so the error messages are displayed at the top of the form. and they've identified the name of the field and the error addressed to it. Now currently our PHP code does this through the for each loop, and by dropping the errors into the error array within the switch case. So within that switch case at the moment, we're only enabling a one error message, whereas on the jQuery validate plugin, we're able to determine whether or not the field is empty, or whether it's not the correct string length, or whether the email address is in fact invalid rather than just being empty. So we could go a bit further with that PHP code and obviously make that a bit more robust for the types of error messages. However, because of the main focus of this being that jQuery validate does most of the hard work on the front end, the PHP code is really only here to provide some simple messages in the unlikely event that, for whatever reason, the jQuery or the JavaScript running isn't available. So at this state, I'm more than happy to leave it in that format. You may want to go a bit further, in which case you can look at doing some more if and else statements within the switch case. For example, using PHP's string length to check whether or not the name and message field are over a certain threshold, and if not, put a different error message into the errors array instead. And you could also go a little bit further with the email field error. You could change it so that if it doesn't validate, check if it's actually empty or not, and then you could just you could place in that instead of being an invalid email address entered, it's no email address entered, or it was left empty. Hopefully this tutorial has given you some idea of some validation techniques, both with jQuery and obviously PHP side, and I hope that it's actually shown the importance of still including the PHP side. I mean, if we have a look at our code for a second, I mean, realistically, if we didn't have the PHP there, we could effectively remove 27 lines or so of code. Actually, that's not a lot of code, and realistically what it's doing, even though it's going through a for each array, there's only 3 items in there at the moment. They're only a single dimension, and that's really not going to have much of an impact, if any, on your users' noticeable performance. So I definitely think at this stage in web development it's still definitely worth doing the PHP validation side of things, just for the case where a user may not be using a JavaScript enabled browser for whatever reason, or they've turned it off, or for whatever is happening on the server, there may be some conflict with other plugins running. And it's 8 o'clock, as you can tell. There may be some conflict with other plugins, for example. So I definitely think it's still worth using both jQuery and the server-side technology, in this case PHP, to do the validation. And there is definitely more you could do with this, but again, I hope this has shown a basic example that you can take away and use, and also something that you could potentially look to build upon. I think it's also worth noting that if you're looking to incorporate this in content management systems, for example, I do a lot of work with WordPress. I would definitely have a look at other plugins that people have done for WordPress first of all, and see how they've done things if you want to implement your own. There's nothing stopping you from implementing your own, but lots of the key features that people have already built into WordPress ones, obviously taken into account more security measures and things like that, and obviously making use of things within WordPress, and it's definitely something you can learn from. So I guess what I'm saying is that this is a good simple example, but definitely don't just implement this and leave it as is if you're going to implement it straight onto your site. You need to obviously take into consideration how the data is being processed, or what data is being sent across your site. And again, you may want to tie this up to a database as well, just to record the details and when it was submitted, for example, so that you can look back on it or have another example even if the email itself is deleted from a user's inbox. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up this tutorial. Again, there were several points in this video towards the beginning where you could have paused the video to have a look at the code, so please do that. I'm not going to be providing downloads for this tutorial. You won't be able to download the source code. And this is primarily because I'm doing these tutorials, all of my tutorials in fact. I'm hoping that people watching them are learning something from them, rather than just coming on and taking and just taking the code as is, because there are thousands of web pages out there. You can Google for a demo and just download the source code. And I know from my own personal experience and my own learning that the way in which I learnt best was finding out how somebody else had done it, looking at how I could change it to best suit my needs, but going through almost a step-by-step process, whether that be a written tutorial or a YouTube video, seeing how someone's done it, why they've done it, and understanding it, because it gives me a much better idea of how these functions work, how these different languages work, and why you might use them. So I guess that, so if you are coming on here and saying, well, where's the download link? There isn't one, and that simply is because I'm hoping that you're going to be learning. You're coming here to learn rather than just take the code off. Again, if you do have any problems with your own code that you've typed up, please feel free to send it through to me. The email address is help@harryfinn.co.uk, and over the next couple of weeks I will be doing some more tutorials, and possibly one of them will be about my new help system that I'm trying to set up. I've been trying to set up for a while and developing, which will hopefully enable both YouTubers and other people that I've worked with or worked for to submit queries about videos or pieces of code, and that I can help a bit more efficiently, and also be able to track your answers and things. So that should be quite a cool little project that I'm hoping to go through with you when that's ready. So again, please leave any feedback below, and if there's anything you'd like me to do in my videos over the next few tutorial series, please just comment below and let me know. I'm going to be looking at some responsive web design stuff, some CSS. I'm going to do a basic PHP tutorial as well, talking through some basic variables and things. So if you've come to this video and thought, gosh, I don't understand half of these functions, that video should be really beneficial to you, and that'll hopefully be up next week. And then we'll probably look at some MySQL stuff, connecting to a database, and then we'll try and do some new WordPress tutorials as well. Because I know I did some a long time ago, and unfortunately didn't have time to really get into them. And WordPress has changed quite a bit since I did those, so it would be nice to go back to those and get up to date with WordPress and where it is now. So talk to you soon, guys. Thanks for watching.